My name is Abigail Brooks. I'm 31 years old, and before my life changed forever, I believed wealth looked like expensive houses, luxury cars, and overflowing bank accounts. My grandmother taught me that real wealth looked like something else entirely. It looked like showing up. Every Saturday for nearly 12 years, I drove my faded pickup truck, 45 minutes to her little farmhouse outside the quiet town of Cedar Hollow. She never asked me to come. She simply left the porch light on. Every week. Rain, snow, heat. It didn't matter. Inside, the smell of fresh bread mixed with lavender filled every room. Grandma Eleanor always greeted me with flour on her hands and a smile that somehow erased every difficult week I'd had. "So," she'd say, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs, "tell me something wonderful. Not something exciting. Not something expensive. Something wonderful." Sometimes it was a student who finally learned to read. Sometimes it was a stray dog I'd helped find a home. Sometimes it was simply watching the sunset after work. She listened as if every story mattered. Because to her, they did. While the rest of my family visited only on holidays, I never thought much about it. Dad always claimed he was too busy. My older brother Chase only came around when he needed money. My cousin Madison loved posting selfies with Grandma online but rarely stayed, longer than 15 minutes. Grandma never complained. She simply kept baking enough pie for everyone, even when most of them never showed up. One chilly October afternoon, we were planting tulip bulbs together when she suddenly stopped digging. She leaned against the fence and smiled toward the hills. "I've had a beautiful life," she said quietly. I laughed. "That sounds like the beginning of a goodbye speech." She smiled. "Maybe it is." I looked at her. She wasn't joking. She reached into her sweater pocket and handed me a tiny brass key attached to faded blue ribbon. "Keep this safe." "What does it open?" "You'll know when the time is right." I wanted answers. Instead, she asked me a question. "If someone gave you $10 million tomorrow, what would you buy?" I thought for a moment. "I'd pay off the school lunch debts for every child in Cedar Hollow." She smiled. Then she nodded once. Exactly once. Looking back, that tiny nod changed everything. December arrived wrapped in fresh snow, turning Cedar Hollow into the kind of small town people only seem to remember during the holidays. Strings of white lights hung from every porch. Children built snowmen in front yards. The bakery on Main Street filled the air with cinnamon and butter before sunrise. Grandma Eleanor insisted on hosting Christmas Eve dinner one last time. She never said why. She simply called everyone herself. "Come hungry," she told each of us. "I've made enough food for an army." When I arrived just before sunset, she was standing on the porch wearing her favorite emerald green cardigan. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older, but her smile hadn't changed. "There you are," she said, wrapping me in a hug. "I was beginning to think the snow had stolen you." Inside, every room glowed with warmth. The old grandfather clock ticked beside the fireplace. Fresh rolls rested beneath a checkered towel. The Christmas tree sparkled with handmade ornaments dating back decades. Each ornament had a story. Grandma remembered everyone. "That little bird?" she said, pointing toward a faded wooden ornament. "Your grandfather carved that after our first Christmas together. It wasn't very pretty, but I loved it anyway." I laughed. "It still isn't very pretty." "It isn't," she agreed, laughing louder than I had heard in months. The rest of the family arrived almost an hour late. Dad entered first, brushing snow off his expensive coat. He hugged Grandma quickly before answering another business call. "Sorry," he muttered. "Year-end numbers." Grandma simply smiled. "Business can wait 10 minutes." "It really can't." Behind him came Chase, carrying nothing but his phone. He barely glanced around before asking, "So, who's cooking next year?" Madison arrived filming everything. "Cute little farmhouse Christmas," she announced into her camera. My followers love vintage holiday vibes. She never actually filmed Grandma. Only the decorations. Only the aesthetic. Only what earned likes. Grandma noticed. She just pretended not to. Dinner was beautiful. Grandma served roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, homemade stuffing, and the blackberry pie everyone claimed to love. For nearly 2 hours, laughter filled the dining room. At least, it sounded like laughter. Listening closely, I realized most conversations revolved around money. Housing prices, stock investments, vacation homes, luxury cars. Nobody asked Grandma how she had been feeling. Nobody noticed she'd barely touched her own dinner. Only once did she catch my eye. She smiled softly, almost sadly. When dessert plates were cleared, Grandma stood. She rested one hand on the back of her chair. "I have one last Christmas gift." She disappeared into her bedroom and returned carrying an old cedar box. Its brass hinges had darkened with age. She placed it carefully on the table. "I've been saving these for a long time." Inside were 5 identical envelopes tied with red ribbon. One for Dad, one for Chase, one for Madison, one for Aunt Karen, one for me. "Open them later," she said gently. "They're personal." Everyone nodded. But patience had never been one of my family's strengths. Dad opened his immediately. Inside was nothing but a folded piece of paper. He frowned. "What is this?" Chase unfolded his own. Madison did the same. Within seconds, confused expressions spread around the room. "They're letters," Madison said. Dad laughed under his breath. "I thought you were finally dividing the property." Grandma remained silent. Chase tossed his letter onto the table. "I don't have time for sentimental stuff." Madison slipped hers back into the envelope without reading past the first paragraph. "I'll read it later." She never would. Dad folded his letter once, then set it beside his empty coffee cup. Only I continued reading. It wasn't long. Just one handwritten page. At the bottom, Grandma had written a single sentence in careful blue ink. "The greatest inheritance is never the one people expect." I looked up. She was already watching me. For a brief moment, the room disappeared. It felt as though she wasn't giving me a letter. She was giving me a responsibility. Something far greater than money. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket. "Thank you, Grandma." She smiled. "I knew you'd understand." At the time, I thought she was talking about the letter. I wouldn't discover the truth until weeks later when that tiny brass key she'd given me, months before, unlocked a hidden room beneath the old farmhouse, revealing a secret that had been quietly changing the lives of Cedar Hollows children for more than 40 years. And when the town learned what Grandma Eleanor had really done, my family's idea of wealth would never be the same. Christmas came and went, and life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Every Saturday, I still drove to Grandma Eleanor's farmhouse. Only now she seemed to tire more easily. Sometimes I'd find her sitting by the window instead of working in the garden. Other times she'd be reading an old novel with a blanket over her knees, smiling as though she already knew how every chapter of life would end. One snowy afternoon in January, we watched birds gather around the feeder outside her kitchen window. A bright red cardinal landed on the fence. Grandma smiled. "They always come back." "The birds?" She shook her head. "The good things." I didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. A week later, the phone rang just after sunrise. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Wilson. Her voice trembled. "Abigail, your grandmother slipped on the back steps while feeding the birds." My heart stopped. I drove through the snow faster than I ever had before. An ambulance sat outside the farmhouse. Paramedics were helping Grandma into the vehicle. Even then, she smiled when she saw me. "I guess the ice won this round." I tried to laugh. Instead, I cried. The doctors recommended surgery followed by months of rehabilitation. Grandma quietly declined. "I've spent my whole life making my own choices," she told the physician. "I'd like to make one more." She chose hospice care at home, exactly where she'd always wanted to be. I requested leave from the elementary school where I taught 4th grade. My principal hugged me before I even finished explaining. "Family first," she whispered. "We'll keep your classroom waiting." I moved into the farmhouse that weekend. The days became wonderfully ordinary. Every morning I made oatmeal while Grandma brewed coffee. We watched the sunrise together from the porch whenever the weather allowed. Sometimes we read books aloud. Sometimes we simply sat together without saying anything. Silence had never been uncomfortable between us. One afternoon, she reached into the drawer beside her bed. Remember the key? I nodded. I still have it. Good. She handed me a folded envelope. Don't open this until Mr. Parker arrives. Who's Mr. Parker? My attorney. I wanted to ask more questions. Instead, I tucked the envelope safely into my backpack. Grandma squeezed my hand. Some answers arrived too early. As February approached, she grew weaker. Yet somehow, she seemed happier. Visitors came and went. Mrs. Wilson brought homemade soup. The pastor stopped by with fresh bread. Children from my school mailed dozens of handmade cards. Every single one went onto the living room wall. Grandma read every message, every drawing, every crookedly written sentence. They think I'm wonderful, she whispered. You are? No, she smiled. I've simply had enough years to practice kindness. On a quiet Thursday morning, the house felt different. The fireplace had burned low. Snow drifted gently past the windows. Grandma opened her eyes one last time. Abigail. I'm here, she smiled. Always were. Those were the last words she ever spoke. She slipped away peacefully, still holding my hand. The funeral brought nearly the entire town together. People filled the little white church until others had to stand outside. I recognized dozens of faces. Former students, teachers, shop owners, firefighters, farmers, families I'd never even met. Each person had a story about Grandma Eleanor, how she'd delivered meals after storms, paid for winter coats, helped someone through college, sat beside hospital beds, comforted grieving neighbors. I listened in amazement. How had one woman quietly touched so many lives? My own family seemed surprised by the turnout. Dad leaned toward me. I had no idea Mom knew this many people. I looked around the crowded sanctuary. They didn't come because they knew her. He frowned. They came because she knew them. 3 days later, Mr. Parker called. The reading of your grandmother's will is scheduled for Monday morning. When I arrived at his office, everyone was already waiting. Dad, Chase, Aunt Karen, Madison. Each wore the same polite smile. The kind people wear when they believe something valuable is about to become theirs. Mr. Parker adjusted his glasses. There is one final instruction your grandmother requested before we discuss her estate. He looked directly at me. Miss Brooks? Did she give you a brass key? I slowly reached into my purse. Yes. He smiled. Excellent. He stood. If you'll all follow me. None of us realized that the little brass key wasn't meant for a bank vault or a safe. It unlocked something far more valuable. Something hidden beneath the old farmhouse for over 40 years. And before the week was over, the entire town of Cedar Hollow would finally discover the extraordinary secret Grandma Eleanor had spent a lifetime protecting. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. The clouds hung low over Cedar Hollow as I parked outside Mr. Parker's law office. My stomach twisted with a mixture of grief and curiosity. The brass key rested in my coat pocket. It felt heavier than it should have. Dad was already there, pacing across the waiting room. Chase sat scrolling through his phone. Madison adjusted her hair in the reflection of the window, barely looking up when I walked in. Nobody asked how I was doing. Nobody mentioned Grandma. They only wanted to know one thing. What did she leave? Mr. Parker greeted us with his usual calm smile. Before we discuss the will, he said, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks left very specific instructions. He placed an old blueprint on the conference table. This is the original floor plan of the farmhouse. We leaned closer. Near the back pantry was a small square room that didn't appear on any modern layout. Dad frowned. I've lived in that house. There's no room there. Mr. Parker smiled. There is. He looked at me. Miss Brooks, would you please bring the key? An hour later, we stood inside the farmhouse kitchen. Mr. Parker walked to the old pantry. He removed 3 dusty shelves that looked as though they had never moved. Behind them was a narrow wooden door almost perfectly hidden within the wall. None of us had ever noticed it. Not once. He held out his hand. I placed Grandma's brass key in his palm. The lock clicked. The hidden door slowly swung open. A narrow staircase disappeared into the darkness below. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the scent of cedar wood and old paper. Dad whispered, I never knew this was here. Mr. Parker looked at him kindly. Your mother intended it that way. We descended carefully. At the bottom waited a surprisingly large room lined with wooden shelves. Boxes, photo albums, leather notebooks, filing cabinets. A long oak table sat in the center beneath an antique lantern. Everything was neatly labeled. Everything was perfectly organized. Grandma had planned this room with incredible care. Madison looked disappointed. So, where's the money? Mr. Parker ignored the question. Instead, he picked up the first notebook. Its cover read, "Neighbors helped." He opened it. Inside were handwritten records stretching back more than 40 years. Names, dates, amounts, medical bills paid, mortgage payments covered, school supplies purchased, emergency repairs funded, scholarships, food deliveries, funeral expenses, every act of kindness carefully recorded, every recipient listed only by first name to protect their privacy. My eyes filled with tears. Grandma hadn't simply helped people. She had quietly carried an entire community through its hardest moments. Without asking for recognition, without expecting thanks, Dad stared silently at page after page. He couldn't finish the sentence. Mr. Parker opened another cabinet. Inside sat dozens of letters. They're from the people she helped. He handed one to me. It read, "Dear Mrs. Brooks, you paid for my daughter's heart surgery when insurance refused. She graduates from medical school next month. She still doesn't know your name because you asked us never to tell her. One day I hope to deserve your kindness." Another letter came from a firefighter. Another from a widow. Another from a young man whose college tuition had been anonymously paid. There were hundreds, maybe thousands. Each told the story of a life forever changed by one quiet woman. Then Mr. Parker unlocked the final cabinet. Inside rested a simple wooden box. No gold. No jewels. Just envelopes, one addressed to each member of the family. "This," he said softly, "is the real inheritance." He handed me mine. I recognized Grandma's beautiful handwriting immediately. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first sentence stole my breath. "If you're reading this, Abigail, then you were still the person I believed you to be." I looked toward the window. For a moment, I could almost hear Grandma laughing softly upstairs. The room fell silent. None of us realized that the letters inside those envelopes would change our family far more than any amount of money ever could. And before the day was over, Dad would finally learn the secret his mother had kept from him for nearly 50 years. For several long moments, no one spoke. The only sound in the hidden room was the soft ticking of an old wall clock. Each of us held an envelope with our name written in Grandma, Eleanor's familiar handwriting. Mr. Parker looked around the room. "Your grandmother asked that everyone read their letters silently." No one argued. Even Dad. I unfolded my letter carefully. The paper smelled faintly of lavender. Grandma must have written it months before. Maybe years. It began simply, "My dearest Abigail, if this letter has reached your hands, then my time in this world has ended, and yours is entering a brand new chapter. I never wanted to leave you money simply because you were kind to me. Kindness should never be purchased. I chose you because you understood something far more valuable. You gave your time freely. Time is the one gift no wealthy person can ever buy back." By the time I reached the bottom of the page, tears blurred every word. She thanked me for ordinary Saturdays, for listening, for sharing coffee, for fixing loose fence boards, for reading books aloud when her eyesight grew weaker. She remembered moments I had completely forgotten. Apparently, she never had. Across the table, Madison quietly wiped away tears. It surprised everyone, including herself. She folded her letter without saying a word. Chase stared at his own page for nearly a minute before lowering it. His confident expression had disappeared. Dad read slower than anyone else. Halfway through, he removed his glasses. Then he read the entire letter again. When he finished, his shoulders slumped. He suddenly looked much older. "What did she write?" Chase finally asked. Dad remained silent. Mr. Parker answered instead. "Mrs. Brooks gave each of you different letters. They were meant only for their recipient." Dad slowly stood. "I'd like to read mine." No one stopped him. His voice trembled. "Dear Michael, You were the greatest joy of my young life. Nothing you have ever done has changed that." He paused, swallowing hard. "But somewhere along the road, you began measuring success by what people owned instead of who they became. I watched you work harder each year. I also watched you laugh less each year." His voice cracked. "You spent so much time building a comfortable life that you forgot to build a peaceful one. No one moved. No one even breathed. I never wanted a wealthy son. I wanted a happy one." Dad lowered the letter. Tears rolled quietly down his face. For the first time in my entire life, I saw my father cry. Not because he'd lost money. Not because he'd failed. Because his mother had understood him better than he had ever understood himself. Mr. Parker gently placed another folder onto the table. "There is one final instruction." He opened the folder. Inside was a document establishing the Eleanor Brooks Community Trust. Grandma had funded it years before. The trust would continue supporting school lunch programs, college scholarships, emergency medical assistance, library improvements, housing repairs for elderly residents. Its funding was permanent. Its investments had already been secured. She had planned decades ahead. Dad looked around the room in disbelief. She did all of this?" Mr. Parker smiled. Quietly. Then he looked directly at me. "Mrs. Brooks appointed you as chair of the trust." My heart skipped. "I've never run a foundation. You won't be alone." He slid another document toward me. The board included Mrs. Wilson, the elementary school principal, the town librarian, the volunteer fire chief, people Grandma trusted, people who cared about the community more than recognition, exactly like she had. That evening, news spread quickly through Cedar Hollow. Not because anyone announced the inheritance, because people began talking. One neighbor remembered the winter Grandma secretly paid their heating bill. Another remembered Christmas gifts left anonymously on the porch. The local newspaper published a story titled, "The Quiet Woman Who Helped an Entire Town." For 2 straight weeks, stories poured in. Teachers, nurses, police officers, mechanics, former students. Each one shared a memory. Each one revealed another act of generosity no one had ever known about. Grandma Eleanor hadn't simply lived in Cedar Hollow. She had quietly become part of nearly every family's story. Late that evening, I returned to the farmhouse alone. The house felt peaceful. Not empty. Peaceful. I made a cup of tea, sat in Grandma's favorite chair, looked out toward the bird feeder. Just as the sun disappeared beyond the trees, a bright red cardinal landed on the fence. It tilted its head, stayed only a few seconds, then flew into the fading light. I smiled through fresh tears. "The good things always come back," I whispered. For the first time since losing Grandma, I finally understood exactly what she had meant. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Cedar Hollow. Snowbanks melted into streams that wandered through the fields, and the first signs of spring appeared around Grandma Eleanor's farmhouse. Tiny daffodil shoots pushed through the soil she had carefully tended for decades. Every morning before work, I walked through her garden. I still expected to see her kneeling beside the roses with gardening gloves that were 2 sizes too big. Sometimes grief doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it quietly follows you through ordinary mornings. The Eleanor Brooks Community Trust officially opened in March. The town library hosted the first meeting. I sat at the long oak table with Mrs. Wilson, Principal Harris, Fire Chief Donnelly, and Mr. Parker. A stack of applications waited in front of us. Medical bills, scholarship requests, emergency home repairs, families asking for help buying groceries. As I looked through them, I realized something that took my breath away. These weren't strangers. They were my neighbors. The people Grandma had quietly cared for all those years. Now it was our turn. Our very first decision involved a little boy named Caleb. His father had recently lost his job, and the family couldn't afford the hearing aids Caleb desperately needed. Without them, he struggled in school. The board voted unanimously. The trust would cover every penny. When Principal Harris called Caleb's parents with the news, his mother cried so hard she couldn't finish the conversation. That evening, I stood in Grandma's garden looking up at the stars. "I hope you saw that," I whispered. The wind stirred the branches overhead. For some reason, It felt like an answer. Not everyone found peace so quickly. Dad kept mostly to himself. He still lived in the same house across town, but people said he had changed. He no longer rushed through conversations. He no longer bragged about work or money. Instead, he volunteered twice a week at the food pantry. Nobody knew why. One afternoon, I stopped by unexpectedly. He was carrying heavy boxes of canned food into the storage room. He looked surprised to see me. "I didn't think you'd come." "I was nearby." We stood there awkwardly. Finally, he sighed. "I spent years believing success meant having more than everyone else." He looked around the pantry. Mom understood something I never did. I waited. "People remember how you make them feel." He smiled sadly. "They rarely remember what you owned." It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. But it was the closest we'd ever been to an honest conversation. A few weeks later, Chase knocked on my front door. He looked exhausted. He held a cardboard box under one arm. "I found these in my garage." Inside were dozens of old family photographs. Birthday parties. Camping trips. Christmas mornings. There was one picture of Grandma teaching us to bake cookies when we were children. We were all covered in flour. Even Dad was laughing. "I forgot we used to be like that," Chase said quietly. So did I. We spent the afternoon sorting photographs into albums. For the first time in years, we talked like brother and sister instead of strangers. Madison surprised everyone most of all. She deleted nearly every social media account she'd spent years building. Instead, she began volunteering at the community center, teaching photography classes to teenagers. One afternoon, she admitted something I'd never expected. "I spent so much time trying to make people think my life was perfect." She looked down at her camera. "And that I forgot to actually live it." Grandma's letter had reached places no lecture ever could. By early summer, Cedar Hollow looked different. Not because the buildings had changed, because the people had. Neighbors greeted one another more often. Local businesses quietly donated supplies to the trust. High school students organized food drives without being asked. Grandma's kindness had become contagious. Her legacy wasn't just helping people. It was inspiring others to help too. On the anniversary of her birthday, the town gathered in the park. The mayor unveiled a simple bronze bench beneath the largest oak tree. The plaque didn't mention money. It didn't mention the trust. It simply read, "In memory of Eleanor Brooks, who taught us that the greatest wealth is a generous heart." No speeches lasted very long. Grandma wouldn't have liked that. Instead, everyone shared stories. A retired teacher remembered the anonymous classroom, supplies that appeared every September. A young firefighter spoke about the scholarship that allowed him to attend the academy. An elderly widow recalled finding groceries on her porch every Christmas morning for nearly 15 years. She never knew who had left them. Until now. As story followed story, I realized something beautiful. No one person knew everything Grandma had done. Each of us carried only a small piece of her kindness. Together. We finally saw the whole picture. That evening, after the crowd had gone home, I remained alone on the bench. The sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. A familiar flutter of wings caught my attention. A bright red cardinal landed on the back of the bench. It stayed only a moment before flying toward the farmhouse. I smiled. Then I stood and followed the path home. For the first time in a very long while, the road ahead didn't feel lonely. It felt like the beginning of something wonderful. By the end of summer, life in Cedar Hollow had found a gentle rhythm again. The community trust was helping more families than we had imagined. Children who once skipped lunch were eating healthy meals. College acceptance letters no longer came with impossible financial worries. Neighbors who had quietly struggled for years finally felt seen. Sometimes, as I signed another scholarship approval, I could almost hear Grandma Eleanor's voice. "Keep the circle going, Abby." And we did. One warm August afternoon, Mr. Parker called. "I found something your grandmother asked me to deliver exactly 6 months after her passing." 6 months? She was very specific. He arrived carrying a long wooden box wrapped in brown paper. On top was a note. "For Abigail. Open only when you've learned that grief and gratitude can live in the same heart." I smiled through watery eyes. That sounds exactly like her. It does, Mr. Parker agreed. Inside the box was an old brass telescope. It looked polished despite its age. Beneath it rested another envelope. The letter explained everything. My dear Abigail, when your grandfather and I were newly married, we couldn't afford vacations. So every Saturday evening, we'd carry this telescope to the hill behind the farmhouse and watch the stars. He always said people spend too much time looking at the ground. You'll never find hope there, he used to tell me. Hope lives higher. If you're reading this, then you've carried my memory long enough. Now I want you to carry your own dreams. Promise me you'll keep looking toward the horizon. Love always. Grandma. I carried the telescope to the hill that evening. The same hill where she and Grandpa had watched countless sunsets together. The sky glowed orange over Cedar Hollow. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about everything she'd given me. A familiar truck pulled into the driveway. It was Dad. He stepped out slowly, holding a small paper bag. I brought pie. I couldn't help smiling. You actually baked? He laughed. I bought it. That's more believable. For a moment, we simply stood there. Then he looked toward the hill. Mind if I join you? We climbed together, not speaking much. We didn't need to. When we reached the top, Dad noticed the telescope. Is that Grandpa's? I nodded. He gently ran his hand along the brass tube. I remember helping him clean this when I was little. He smiled sadly. I'd forgotten. We spent the next hour watching stars appear one by one. Finally, Dad spoke. I owe you an apology. I looked at him. I spent years chasing promotions. Bigger houses. Newer cars. I thought providing for my family was enough. His voice became quiet. I forgot they also needed me. The words hung between us. I can't change the past. No, I answered. But you can change tomorrow. He nodded. I'd like to. For the first time since Grandma's funeral, I believed him. Over the next few months, Dad kept showing up. Not with grand speeches. Not with expensive gifts. He simply came. Sometimes he helped repair fences around the farmhouse. Sometimes he delivered groceries to families through the trust. Sometimes we drank coffee on the porch in comfortable silence. Grandma had always said trust grows slowly, like oak trees. She had been right. In October, Cedar Hollow celebrated its annual Harvest Festival. For decades, Grandma Eleanor had organized the children's reading tent. This year, everyone expected it to remain empty. Instead, dozens of volunteers arrived carrying books. Mrs. Wilson smiled at me. We're keeping her tradition alive. Children gathered on blankets while parents stood nearby. When someone asked who would read the opening story, every eye turned toward me. I opened Grandma's favorite picture book, the same one she'd once read to me. As I reached the final page, I looked up. The tent was completely silent. Not because the children were bored, because they were listening. Exactly the way Grandma always listened. With their whole hearts. In that moment, I understood something she'd spent a lifetime teaching without ever saying aloud. A person's greatest inheritance isn't land, money, or possessions. It's the kindness they leave behind in other people's lives. And that kind of inheritance never runs out. Autumn slowly faded into winter again. Almost a full year had passed since Grandma Eleanor had stood in her kitchen, smiling quietly as the family gathered for what none of us knew would be our last Christmas together. The farmhouse looked different now. Not because it had changed, because it was full again. Children visited every Saturday for reading hour. Neighbors stopped by for coffee. The garden, once cared for by Grandma alone, had become a community project. It belonged to Hope. On the first Saturday of December, I arrived home after delivering scholarship letters to 12 high school seniors. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed a small package leaning against the front door. There was no stamp, no return address, only my name, written in handwriting I knew by heart. Abigail. My heart skipped. It couldn't be. Slowly, I carried the package inside. Mr. Parker had arranged this. Tucked beneath the ribbon was a note in his handwriting. Your grandmother asked me to deliver this exactly 1 year after her final Christmas dinner. I smiled through tears. She planned everything. Inside the package was a small wooden music box, the same one Grandpa had once built for Grandma during their first year of marriage. When I wound the tiny key, a soft melody filled the room. Hidden beneath the velvet lining was one last letter. I unfolded it carefully. My dearest Abigail, if you're reading this, then you've made it through your first year without me. I know it wasn't easy. Grief has a funny way of making ordinary days feel extraordinary, and extraordinary days feel impossible. But if you've smiled again, truly smiled, then you've already honored me more than flowers ever could. There is one final favor I want to ask. Every Christmas Eve, leave one empty chair at your table, not because someone is missing, because someone new may need a place to belong. Invite the neighbor who lives alone, the teacher who can't travel home, the young family starting over. Kindness grows when there's always room for one more. That is the only inheritance worth protecting. With all my love, Grandma. I pressed the letter against my heart. Then I looked around the quiet farmhouse. For the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt full of every lesson she had ever taught me. Christmas Eve arrived. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky. The dining table was larger than it had ever been, not because I had bought a new one, because neighbors had carried extra tables into the living room until they stretched from one wall to the other. Mrs. Wilson brought homemade bread. The fire chief arrived with smoked turkey. The librarian baked 3 apple pies. My 4th grade students made handmade ornaments for every guest. Dad came early. Without being asked, he helped set the table. Chase carried chairs in from the garage. Madison spent the evening taking family photos, but this time, she never posted a single one online. She simply printed them and handed copies to everyone before they left. People had changed. Not overnight, but little by little, exactly the way Grandma believed they could. At the center of the table stood one empty chair, just as her letter requested. An hour before dinner, there was a knock at the door. Outside stood a young woman named Emily and her 7-year-old son, Noah. They had moved to Cedar Hollow only 3 weeks earlier after losing their home in another state. Mrs. Wilson had told them about our Christmas dinner. Emily looked embarrassed. I don't want to intrude. I smiled. You're exactly who the empty chair is for. Tears filled her eyes. That night, Noah laughed louder than anyone at the table. By dessert, he was helping Dad build a gingerbread house. Emily later admitted it was the first real Christmas her son had smiled through since losing his father. I quietly glanced toward Grandma's favorite chair. For just a second, I could almost imagine her sitting there, smiling, satisfied. The following spring, the Eleanor Brooks Community Trust celebrated its first anniversary. More than 100 students had received scholarships. Hundreds of families had been helped with groceries, medical bills, school supplies, and emergency housing. The old farmhouse officially became the Eleanor Brooks Community House, a place where anyone in Cedar Hollow could find a meal, a book, or simply someone willing to listen. Above the front door hung a simple wooden sign. There is always room for one more. Those words became the heart of our town. Years later, children who had received scholarships returned as teachers, nurses, firefighters, and business owners. Many volunteered with the trust. Some donated. Others simply gave their time. The kindness Grandma planted decades earlier kept growing long after she was gone, like an oak tree whose roots reached farther than anyone could see. Sometimes on quiet Saturday evenings, I'd carry Grandpa's brass telescope to the hill behind the farmhouse. The stars looked just as they always had. I'd sit there with a cup of coffee, listening to the wind move through the trees. And whenever a bright red cardinal landed on the old fence nearby, I couldn't help but smile. Maybe it was only a bird. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it reminded me of something I would never forget. The greatest inheritance isn't measured in dollars. It isn't written into a will. It isn't locked inside a bank. The greatest inheritance is the love we leave behind, because love is the only treasure that becomes larger every time we give it away. The end. Please like and subscribe Heartwarming Tales.